Right, so greetings, hello. It's Thomas Daffin again, and it's the day after the amazing march in London, which was yesterday, the 23rd of March. I want to say congratulations to everybody that was marching against Brexit in London yesterday. The police say 2 million people. I mean, that is quite a lot. And if you look at the pictures from the air, you know, it's possible the march was 2 miles long and very, very wide and densely packed. Yeah, 2 million people, that's about right. That's kind of what I hoped. I very nearly was able to go myself, but I live 600 miles south of London. It wasn't possible, sadly, but I was there in spirit. And I want to add my comments here today. I mean, there were some great speeches made. I've been watching Michael Heseltine, Nicola Sturgeon, Tom Watson and the other people who were there. No doubt the others will all be put online eventually. It must have been very moving to be there. And I know Parliament well, I know Parliament Square where it took place. I did organise over 30 meetings in the House of Lords when I lived in London on ethics and policy and peace. And I can't echo more than, you know, it's possible Michael Heseltine's plea that the European Union was created as a peace project. It may have lost its way a little bit, and like all power constellations, it attracts sometimes the wrong people who do the wrong thing for the wrong reason, but on the whole, it's a 100% sound project. And the propaganda against it has come, I think, from extremist forces within Europe, sort of latent neo-fascist extremist groups, some extremist left-wing groups that also just hate the idea of capitalist societies being able to get on and you know, moderate their capitalism. They want a sort of complete Stalinist model, so those people don't like it. I think we've also had definite foreign interference in the Brexit vote from the US and probably Russian intelligence sources. The facts will show this, and we know that for a fact. So, you know, but gradually and slowly the common sense of the British people is now reasserting its right to democracy and saying, no, you know, we've changed our minds, we don't want to exit the European Union, we love Europe, we're part of its civilization and culture. Europe loves us, it's a mutual thing, you know. Sir Walter Scott was the most favourite novelist in Europe, Shakespeare was the most favourite playwright in Europe. You know, the Europeans love the British and the British love the Europeans. We are interconnected. This idea that we're separate foreign people and is a fantasy land. And when it comes to the Irish, the Welsh and the Scots, they're indelibly and inextricably bound up with European culture and civilization. The modern university that we have in Europe was a European-wide foundation. I mean, the first was in Bologna in Italy and Paris. You know, the university as a scholastic endeavour by colleagues to find ultimate truth, based largely on the Christian teachings, but then broadening out and looking at all the other faiths and so on, as in the intellectual history of Europe ever since the 1200s. So that's the European mind in search of truth. That's a continent-wide project. It's not. I mean, I'm an Oxford ex-teacher and a London graduate, but I'm not arrogant. I'm not going to say London is the only university. No, Vienna, Paris, the Sorbonne, you know, Montpellier, it has a very ancient and wonderful university, purported apparently to be first founded by some Muslim theologians, you know, who were connected to the south of France and the Muslim culture of Andalusia. So, and brought medicine to Montpellier. It became its great achievement. So, and then you look up at the north, Stockholm, Uppsala, Copenhagen, Oslo, the great universities up there where I've studied and sometimes lectured, and, you know, we're all in one big project here. It's called European Intellectual Endeavour for Ultimate Truth, and I'm speaking as coordinator of the European Foundation for the World Intellectual Forum, which is a global project to parallel the World Economic Forum in Davos. Economists can't solve the problems of the world. We need much more joined up thinking, We need to bring intellectuals from every different branch, the humanities, the sciences, the arts, and economics, and all the others. Philosophy, theology, and so on. So that's kind of what I'm doing here, and why I'm speaking out against Brexit, because it is the most serious affront to Britain's self-comprehension of what our role is in the world. And it was so lovely to see yesterday in London. Many of my friends were there, but I watched on television, live streaming and so on, that's the British people saying, enough is enough. Brexit is a stupid idea. And I've actually come to the conclusion that Brexit really should be defined as a cult. A friend of mine runs the Cult Watch Observatory at the London School of Economics. And there's every sign that Brexit actually falls into what is called a cult. It has charismatic leaders like Farage and so on, who seem demented to me. And it pursues its own self-promotion in the teeth of all possible evidence and empiricism. So it's against science. Well, that's what cults are like. It has a self-destructive element to it, which cults also do. It's ultimately engaged in a kind of suicide stroke murder operation, which is what cults do. If you think about the Manson cult, when this crazy guy got people to pledge to either suicide or murder, Ernst Becker, in his psychoanalytical study of cults and destructive behaviour, Thanatos, talks about in his book The Denial of Death, the charismatic leader who the group then transfer onto them. It's called transference in psychoanalytical literature. Their own sort of longing for immortality, which is what the death cult is. And Hitler's a classic case in point. He analyses how that happened. Brexit has all the hallmarks of that, and it's interesting that the people that are really for Brexit often are quite violent, verbally abusive, and even physically, we've seen. It's tragic, the woman who got the referendum, let's revoke and remain, and it's now hit 5 million signatures in a few days. She's had death threats from these Brexit types because, it's a death cult. And if you say, no, we want to live, we love Europe, we love Britain, we want to stay together, you get death cults. You get hate stuff. And even that MP, Anna Soubry, a very brave woman, who said, no, the Tory party seems to have bought into this death cult. And I'm not having it. I would say she's a true conservative, that woman. She's receiving death threats and she can't even go home. All this tells you that this Brexit thing is a death cult, and it's very dangerous. And I'm going to be addressing that because I have a duty as a philosopher for peace. I've worked in medicine. I'm interested in psychoanalytical analysis of conflict and violence. That's what my PhD was on. I have a whole thesis written about transpersonal psychology and history, and this is a classic and tragic example of how people become obsessed by a sort of the heroic myth of it's like the Beowulf story, we the heroic people will conquer Europe. But it's misguided because Europe itself is a story about how they conquered the death cult that was Hitler. That was a true death cult, the SS, and the Holocaust, which they did, the mass extermination attempted of an entire people and race. This was a death cult, of demonic proportions, Hitlerism. And the European Union was a liberal democratic attempt to say never again, that's enough of that nonsense. Which is very deep and tragically in the European soul, the berserker, the one that will kill rather than talk to you. Yeah, that's Europeans can be like that. But the true European soul is not. That's the Minotaur, the vicious one who has to kill the virgins. And so you take the sacrificial virgin to the Minotaur. The true European hero is Theseus, who succeeds in coming to terms with that beast, that inner beast, and then conquering it and setting those virgins free. We have to slay the Minotaur all over again, it seems. All Theseuses have to be clever. We have to be sneaky because, the devil, the Minotaur, the beast is out and prowling about. And we all thought that have been put to bed. But no, it's tragic, isn't it? In each generation, you can get these death cults coming up again. And Brexit suddenly has turned into one, which is horrendous. And so it was so lovely to see some, millions of ordinary, decent, intelligent people, British people, marching with their feet yesterday. And hats off to you all. Also, I noted with great satisfaction there were parallel demonstrations taking part in Bangor, in Truro, all over the country. And this is my little demonstration, the day after. As a philosopher, I can only philosophize. But I think that has value, and I hope that you'll enjoy my comments and observations on where we're at with Brexit. So my talk today is going to be in three parts. The first part is really addressing the philosophical dimensions of Brexit and how we stop it. The second is the theological, and it's a Sunday, I'm fasting, it's my day of musing on the divine aspect of existence, and many millions of Christians all over the world on a Sunday are doing the same. So I'm going to be speaking to the theological aspect of Brexit. And thirdly, I'll address the political, because obviously it's a political process, and there will be very important debates and discussions and hopefully votes in Parliament next week. And as I say, I've studied the workings of the House of Commons and Parliament in great detail. I used to organise meetings there as a NGO leader. I chose to do it in the House of Lords because I found the Lords, on the whole, more intelligent and more people of their word than the people in the Commons. The Commons, I experienced, they just, because they're always scrabbling for votes, they don't have a solidity. They'll be supporting you with one year and then opposing you the other year. I found people in the Lords, on the whole, much easier to deal with as a philosopher. And I'd like to see more opposition from the Lords. I know Lord Adonis is trying to rally opposition, but I'd like to see, if the House of Lords say absolutely, categorically, we refuse to pass Brexit, which is what they ought to do, and they keep trying to say it, that would help. Anyway, moving on, let me address first then the philosophical side of Brexit, because I am a philosopher. I'm coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Britain and Europe. I've been active since the 80s, when I was first active and engaged in stopping the Cold War. I was at Greenham Common, and I was campaigning against the idea of nuclear omnicide. I spoke at conferences all over the world. I went to Russia. I was elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace internationally for a time. I'm now vice president of that International Philosophers Against Omnicide. We don't want the world to destroy with nuclear weapon conflict breaking out. And we don't want the world to be destroyed by endless thousands of conventional wars, and also the vast militarism expenditure that goes on in the Pentagon, the MOD, and their equivalents in Russia and China. We want to stop that. We want money for the people, for normal people to have normal lives. The European Union doesn't have a military budget. We like it. It's a peace organisation. We want it to have a peace service, a peace mediation service, not an army. Let NATO do all that stuff, Let's get all the armies scaled down. So, philosophically, well, I just want to share one thing really, which is that I studied philosophy at the University of Bristol in the 70s, and I was taught Kantian philosophy by a foremost expert, Stefan Korner, who was a great man, who'd survived the Holocaust. He was Jewish. He'd been hidden in a farmyard in Central Europe, for a few years with his family, and they survived when the Nazis came looking for them. A horrendous, thought that you'd have to live like that. What a scary and terrifying time to live in when you're being persecuted just for your race or your religion or whatever. He then went and studied philosophy. He was self-made. He wasn't wealthy particularly, but he mastered particularly Kantian thought, and he became one of Europe's great thinkers in the Kantian tradition. And I remember talking to him and studying with him at Bristol. And one of the many things I learned, and I've subsequently taught at university and school level in teaching philosophy A level and so on, is this concept that Kant had called the categorical imperative. Kant was a great ethical teacher, And philosophy is, has many different branches. Epistemology looks at the nature of knowledge. Metaphysics looks at the nature of ultimate reality and where do we come from? Is there a soul? Where does it go after death? And what happens to the collective soul of the planet? And metaphysics is a whole other branch. But ethics tells us how we should act. Should we do this or should we do that? Life is full of complex ethical choices every day, all the time. And there are many, many different theories being developed by ethical philosophers, going back to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle invented the notion of virtue ethics, which is very important. We should always act in a virtuous way. Because he proposed, and I think he was right, that ultimately virtuous actions lead to happiness, both for oneself and others. And the point and goal of philosophy is to create happiness. I mean, Christ was a sort of freelance philosopher when he got up and said his Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Happy are those who are pure in heart, for they shall know God." I mean, he was teaching pure, virtue ethics there. He was saying, what is the road to happiness? Well, it's through being pure in heart. Kathar in kardios in the Greek. Pure in heart means being transparent to spirit, not lying, not dissimulating, to oneself and to God, to the Great Spirit. So Christ was, in a sense, following on, whether he knew it or not. I'm not sure the details of Christ's own philosophical studies. I doubt that he probably had heard of Aristotle and Plato, but he was in a context in which he wasn't using their teachings as authoritative. He was working within a biblical context on the whole. Although I think Christ also was working within an Enochian context of parabiblical apocryphal literature. But anyway, the basic idea of Kant, the categorical imperative, is we should act in such a way that if everybody acted in that same way, everybody would become happier and more virtuous and more enlightened. It's the kind of also called the principle of universalizability. So if I tell the truth and I make significant contributions to the debate on Brexit, I do it because I hope other people will be doing the same. I hope that there's a ripple out effect and that suddenly people wake up and realise Brexit, I mean, if we haven't already, there's 5 million people already signed that petition. There's all the evidence that millions of people have woken up and realised Brexit is stupid. I hope one day, therefore, very shortly, it'll be voted out by Parliament and I won't have to keep going on about it. Until that happens, I will be fasting every Sunday and recording a talk. Until that is literally, Brexit is completely stopped. Probably by a second referendum. I think that's the fair way of doing it. If a second referendum votes again in favour of Brexit, then, so be it. But I don't think it will. And I also think that, I believe strongly it would. All the signs are that Remain would now win. It should be put to the people. We should have a second vote. So Kant said that if we act in a way that's universalizable, that is that is the definition of ethics, of goodness. If we're loving, and everybody's loving, then the whole world becomes a loving place. If we're generous, and so on. So he tried to explain the metaphysics of ethics. The basic thinking behind the metaphysical teachings underlying this ethical position is that we are literally each other. There is an interconnectedness to all existence. So if I try and love and be kind and loving here in the middle of France, it sends out a sort of magical telepathy to all other beings, and the whole planet eventually becomes loving and kind and enlightened. And it's a sort of sympathetic magic almost, and it's what shamans do, and it's what druids and other esoteric students of the mysteries are premised on. But Kant put it in bald terms, in terms of ethical philosophy. Now the contrary is also the case. You see, if one argues that one should destroy the European Union, one should leave it, one should destroy one's own country, which is what the UK leaving the European Union will do, that one should ignore the wishes of huge sections of the population, the Scots, the Northern Irish who voted to remain, nearly half of the English who voted to remain. If one ignores all that and just ploughs on with an unpopular policy, even though people have obviously changed their minds, that's against the Kantian categorical imperative, because what we're saying then is that it's fine for people who seize power in a minority through political machination, which is what the Tory party have done. The Tories don't have the vast majority of the people of Britain supporting them. They're a very small sect or cult, actually. I'd say the Tory party itself is a kind of dangerous cult. And they have various charismatic leaders, and they have a sort of mythology, Churchill, blah, blah, that justifies. Again, it's a death cult. They're self-destroying the UK. And if you don't like that, well, in the old days, you'd be shot if you dared speak up against it. And that's why the liberal tradition in Britain arose, because we spoke up against this Tory death cult. And I mean, originally, the conservatism was a sensible idea. It opposed Robespierre and the fanatics of the French Revolution. And there were moderate conservatives who said, look, come on, we like progress, we like democracy, but not taking it to that extreme. We don't want to chop the heads off all the aristocrats. So the kind of myth of the Scarlet Pimpernel, Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, the heroic conservatives then opposed that nationalist terrorism, state terrorism, which was practiced under the dictatorship of Robespierre, and said, no, we just want people to have normal kind of lives, and we want to conserve that, what is best in our culture, Britain. And so conservatism as an ideology had a sort of raison d'etre, and some very intelligent people, like Edmund Burke and Sir Walter Scott and others, supported it, and it was appropriate. However, like all thought movements, it can turn into its opposite. And, it did things during the course of the 19th and 20th centuries which I wouldn't agree with, and I think were wrong. And Brexit, which has now become its sort of project, I think is actually the self-destruction of the Tory death cult. It's going to lead in its own destruction. What I don't want is that it takes the country down. Britain is not the Tory party. Britain is much bigger, older and wiser than that. Britain is us, the people. Britain is the millions of people marching yesterday and in other places. Britain is the Welsh, the Cornish, the Irish, the English, the Scots, all the immigrants, the multicoloured, multi-rainbow people of London, where I grew up and taught, and Brighton for many years, and where my PhD is from. That's who we are. We're not this Tory death cult that wants Brexit. Thank you. I mean, they're part of the British history, but we have to grow out of that aspect. And we have to realise where it's coming from and name it as such. Now, you see, the Brexit thing, if it tries to universalise itself, what it ends up with is total subversion, chaos, violence, and destabilisation. And we end up with sort of right-wing racist fanatics like the guy in New Zealand that killed people, 49 Muslims shot in a mosque. He's coming from a sort of racist ideology like Breivik in Norway, that think that using violence to destroy the system because the system is evil. The system is social democracy and allowing immigrants in, therefore let's kill the social democrats. That's what Breivik reasoned, which is like not reasoning at all. It's anti-reason. And this chap in New Zealand is doing the same. These are irrational, and that's one of the features of death cults, and they are irrational. In fact, they're anti-rational and they're anti-intellectual. So if you meet people that are hardline Brexiteers, they are anti-rational and anti-intellectual. And of course, they box themselves into this place where, because all the intellectuals and scientists oppose Brexit, therefore they're all corrupt, they're all wrong, and they're all in some great conspiracy. Only we, the true Brexiteers, know the truth. That's a hallmark of cults. It's the kind of flat earth types. So I don't think that the categorical imperative of Kant is being fulfilled by the Brexit nightmare. On the contrary, it's the complete opposite. Okay, so I'm going to not continue. I mean, my philosophical position is complex, and I've explained it in many previous talks, and we can come back to it. But that's what I want to say in that first part. I want to move on now and talk about theology, because theology is like philosophy taken to its deepest form. Theology is ultimate discourse about the gods, or it was a pagan term actually, developed by Heraclitus and some other philosophers and Pythagoras, that it's possible to talk about ultimate reality, and we have a duty to, and also to reason about ultimate reality, and to figure out what these gods are and what they want of us. Do they want our self-destruction? Are there gods sitting up in heaven watching Brexit and laughing? I don't think so. I think the gods want our happiness and well-being, and whatever theology you're coming from, Hindu or Buddhist or pagan or runic or Druid or Christian or Jewish or Islamic, from my study of them all, I've come to the view that there's a common core principle at work inside them all, which works towards our enlightenment and liberation. The point of the Christ, the point of the Avatar, the point of the Messiah is that from time to time in history, the Christ, the Avatar, the Messiah turns up in history as Zoroaster, as Moses, as Christ, as Buddha, as Mahavira, as etc., etc., in order to preserve and sustain and retain our intelligence so that we're intelligent enough to remain here. This is an amazing planet. We have to live righteously, or we will lose our right to be here, and will self-destroy. And self-destruction, which seems to be tragically, something that human beings do from time to time, they get into a tizzy and start killing themselves, is something that we have to analyse and grow out of. I mean, I'm interested in the scientific study of conflict and violence. I worked with the Conflict Research Society and colleagues at different universities throughout Britain and Europe. My PhD explores in detail the analysis of why people do violence to each other. It's pathological. But in a nutshell, I would say that it's by focusing on some part of truth instead of being open to the wholeness of truth. A fanatic, an extremist, a cult follower, has some little bit of truth and then blows it up out of all proportion, and it becomes the only truth. And you see it again and again in history. People that have a little tiny bit of truth then become fanatics and impose that truth on everyone else and silence all the other discourse. And it happens again and again in history. It's with tragic consequences. I mean, to give an example, the Christianization of the Hellenic Roman world, unfortunately, was accompanied by fanaticism and a silencing of truth. And when it became political and the emperors converted, or so-called converted to Christianity, they kept a lot of the trappings of the evils of emperorship. And so they were still doing persecutions and killings, but now in the name of Christianity. I mean, that was a fake conversion. It was a fake. It wasn't true Christianity. That they were persecuting the Gnostics, the actual people that had known people who'd walked with Jesus and had those teachings. They were forced to hide their gospels in, the Egyptian deserts or whatever, just to kind of escape persecution. And this idea of orthodoxy arose. In the name of which great crimes are committed, and were being committed here in France in the 1200s when the so-called Catholic army went to massacre all the Cathars because they were Gnostics, So theology is keeping sight of the wholeness of things makes you truly open to further insight and wisdom and to higher truths. So I think the problem with Brexit is it's seized on some little part of the truth and then blows it up out of proportion. Yes, there are things that need changing about the European Union, of course, and it needs all kinds of things. I'd like to see a freedom of information law passed, access to freedom of information in all the corridors of power. I'd like to see a maximum wage set for civil servants working for the European Union. I've said this before and I'll repeat it, that no civil servant working for the European Union should earn more than the lowest paid Prime Minister in the European Union. I mean, it's obvious to me that Prime Ministers should be, elevated to a position higher than European Union bureaucrats. So that the European Union doesn't assume this kind of plenipotentiary with locus of all power type thing, but no, it's the servant of the people of Europe. I'd like to see more support for its cultural projects, more support obviously for its intellectual work. I'd like to see a European Intellectual Council. They already have a Scientists' Council, but I'd like to see more intellectual input into the European Union, more roles in shaping policy about vision. I'd like to see a European Union mediation service. I'd like us to be working more actively for peace. I certainly want the UK to participate in the European Union elections on May the 29th, I think it is. I think it's very important. We should get a long postponement of Brexit, have a long period of reflection, have a second referendum, and have a vote in these European elections. And why? Well, because theologically, it's very stupid of us not to revoke and change our minds on Brexit. Brexit, as I've said, is a sort of death cult dreamed up by some very obscure and very strange people without a theological understanding. And there's nothing I've read in the Christian, the Islamic, or the Jewish, or the Hindu, or the Jain, or any other faith, the Sikhs, that says when a country's going really well, and it's in unity and in relative peace, there's no wars, that's the time when you should break it up. That's the time when you should tear it apart and ignore whole parts of public opinion and ignore what the Scots vote for, ignore what the Northern Irish want, etc., etc. That the implication of that is just it's the opposite of truth. It's a lie. So I want to reflect that on this day in 1603, on the 24th of March, a very important event happened in British history, and I've talked about this before, but I'm going to kind of celebrate it again. Well, a tragic thing happened, and then a good thing. The tragic thing was that Queen Elizabeth I died on this day, in 1603, the 24th of March. She was a very interesting woman, an intellectual herself, of Tudor descent. I've met people that are of the Tudor family when I lived in Wales. Tudor comes from a word meaning from Theodore, the gift of God. It was a Greek term. They came from Anglesey, which was the Druid Isle of Britain, and the Tudors were descended ultimately from the Druids. And Elizabeth knew all that. She was a learned lady, and she had in her court Dr. John Dee, who was also Welsh and a Druid, and he was her mentor in a sense. I went to the Royal College of Physicians to an exhibition of John Dee's books. He was a great bibliophile like me, and I've always respected Dee's importance as a figure. He was an intellectual and a magus operating on pan-European level. He travelled all over Europe, and he would definitely have been, like me, a Remainer. He was a great man of peace as well, and so he would have been horrified at Brexit. And he was British, but lived in London from ancient